it's a fundamental issue that we're facing as protected area managers, as conservationists, and obviously with this audacious undertaking. It's not an easy project. Looking after 2,000 rhino is really, really, really enormous, and I think even so, moving 2,000 rhino is even bigger.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to share a new podcast series in partnership with African Parks, Conservation Across Africa. Over the month of June, we sit down with 6 leaders from African Parks to explore how they're protecting biodiversity and managing some of the most iconic landscapes across the continent. On the second episode of our series on conservation across Africa, we're joined by Donovan Jooste, Rhino Rewilding Project Manager at African Parks, to talk about one of the most ambitious conservation efforts on the continent, the rewilding of 2,000 southern white rhinos and their future offspring over the next decade. We'll explore how African Parks plans to translocate these rhinos to well-managed protected areas across Africa, helping to create and strengthen populations that can secure the species' long-term survival. 2,000 rhinos, 10 years. Let's get into the story behind this monumental effort. I want to welcome everyone back to our series with African Parks. I'm talking about conservation across Africa and all the work that they do. Today, we're going to be focusing on rhinos and specifically a rhino relocation project, relocating 2,000 southern white rhinos across Africa. It's a really cool conversation. But joining us today, we have Donovan Jooste, the Rhino Rewilding Project Manager for African Parks. Don, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this topic. I think I was telling you on the beginning, this is something that I've been looking forward to ever since we started kind of drafting this series, because this is something that, you're rewilding 2,000 rhinos. It just seems like such a huge project and something that's just amazing that y'all are doing. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for what you do. And I think the first thing I'll ask you is, could you just talk about your job, what you do with African Parks, how long you've been with the organization, all of these things?
Yeah, thanks, Preston. Thank you very much for having us. It's a great honor. It's a great privilege to tell our story. So a little bit about myself. I've been with African Parks since 2021. Initially destined for other landscapes, which haven't seemingly become a reality as of yet. So I joined the Rhino Rewild Project basically in its infancy when African Parks were still in the acquisition phase, which was a great learning and a great opportunity. Obviously, having studied in this field, basically done my degree in game ranch management and been in conservation ever since 2013, specializing in protected area management and spending a lot of time in African countries. It's sort of like dovetailed together quite nicely, if you will. And obviously from my side, a massive privilege and a massive honor to work for African Parks and to work with such a key species and such a significant project across the African continent.
Yeah, it's super cool. I would say, and I'll probably say the same thing about a lot of these episodes that we've had with African Parks. For me, a lot of my knowledge was pretty much non-existent on, let's say, something like a rhino before I started looking into these things. And now my mind is just wide open. I'm like, man, we've got to save this species. We got to do everything we can. We got to donate money. But I think conversations like this is so critical because, again, you have people that, like myself previously, that might not understand much, but you get experts like yourself to come on and talk about what you do and all the cool work that African Parks is doing. The first kind of question I'll ask you, though, because, I mean, we talk about rhino rewilding. We talk about, your title as this rewilding project manager. This term of rewilding, I do want to understand this a little bit. I think even yesterday or the day before, I'd seen a post on social media somewhere. I think Leonardo DiCaprio had posted something about some rewilding project, and this term. I'm just very curious about what this means. And in the context, we'll get into the context of what it means for rhinos. But could you just tell us a little bit about what rewilding is?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously linking in directly to African Parks' portfolio, what we do is specialize in protected area management, and there's quite a few facets or pillars of that, and obviously most importantly, our end goal is conservation of species and looking at biodiversity thereof. So I mean, historically, a lot of the national parks, a lot of the conservation areas, a lot of the sort of areas dedicated, large, big areas dedicated to wildlife, have either in some manner or form been mismanaged to a degree, have been unregulated in offtake, have been really depleted. Obviously, there's a couple of areas that stand out. For example, in South Africa, Kruger National Park being a flagship park, would maybe be an exemption of that. But the more sort of north we go, and the more we dive deeper into these protected areas, the more one realizes that there's so much space available. But as of historic hunting, sort of loss of habitat through human encroachment, unrest through war, mismanagement of protected areas, that's obviously resulted in a lot of these areas being completely depleted of wildlife, having no wildlife, but having massive space. And I think that's where the rewilding component comes into it. Specifically, we obviously, when we'll get into it, where we focus on rhinos rewilding. Rewilding is multi-species across multi different landscapes that can be done. It's basically the essence of taking thriving populations of animals, moving them into populations or into landscapes that are now sort of on the road to recovery through sort of good law enforcement methods, good infrastructural establishments, good management practices, and I think the rewilding is the cherry on the cake, if you will. If we get to a point where we can start reintroducing, augmenting species in these landscapes and in these protected areas, it definitely indicates that the area is on the right track with regards to successful management, that the offtake is being sort of managed, whether it's sustainable utilization or through illegal offtake or whatever the case may be. Once these animals return to a system, it indicates the health of the system and the health of the ecosystem, which obviously contributes massively to biodiversity. So in essence, the rewilding component is basically the animals coming back into the area that are being looked after from whatever conservation sort of body or entity is at play. And that's obviously something that us at African Parks are really good at and really well versed at.
So I think on that note, you kind of just gave me a thought. I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but when talking about rewilding, what I think of, if you're trying to protect a species, you might put them in captivity, right? You might, in my head, put a large fence around them. You're trying to protect them. You're trying to make sure that, things like poaching, things like, threat of wildlife management issues, any of these things might not happen because you just fence something in and you protect them. But I'm curious about, in this case, rewilding versus captivity, and why it's really essential to reintroduce, let's say, rhinos, for example, into the wild, into these environments, rather than keeping them in controlled environment where you're just kind of fencing them in. Could you talk through those two things and why rewilding is actually the better solution rather than keeping animal species in captivity?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a very interesting debate, and specifically looking at a couple of countries with the successful ranching models that have been in play. I mean, putting it down to rhino specifically, that's in theory what saved the rhino 100, 120 years ago, the absolute intensive farming of these animals to get their numbers up. While there's a niche and a need for that, I think if one takes a step back and starts looking at it a little bit more holistically, while species abundance is a really, really good thing for the sort of value of the species and the longevity of the species, even more important is the ecological role these species play. So if we use the sort of ranching example, there's a massive monetary value on some of these animals, the scarcer breeds, and animals that basically were in a bit of a low number scenario a few years back. However, I think we often overlook the ecological value that these animals play. So, I mean, fast forwarding to Rhino, and the reason that we feel that rewilding is an important component to the success of the species is that there's a couple of factors that play a role here. It's obviously Rhino are renowned for shaping ecosystems, maintaining sort of grass, lawns, and open areas, which obviously contributes massively to other species that dwell in similar environments. It also has a contribution towards biodiversity at large. I think the age-old, the rhino walks, it eats the grass. A certain bird will sift through the grass seeds in the rhino's dung. A raptor would then sort of go for the bird that's just eaten the dung, and that normal sort of circle of life. And I think the utmost difference between, or the biggest difference between the ranching component and the actual big protected area landscape components is that these species are playing that role where at the stage, and obviously we'll get into it, where we've got just under 2,000 rhino at the project site at the moment. While it's absolutely significant for the species, these species are in a single area, so we haven't de-risked the species at all. We haven't sort of distributed the species to several protected areas. We're not having any sort of ecological impact from the rhino, all being located in a captive, semi-captive environment. And I think importantly, Preston, one of the biggest things, specifically if we bring it back home to rhino, is rhino are genuinely a sentinel species. So if there's issues within your landscape or your protected area or your conservancy or whatever, generally the first species to be removed because of illegal sort of obtaining of the species is rhino. And equally so, rhino basically are a conduit for other species and the protection thereof. We're in such an environment at the moment where rhino require massive amounts of financial backing, efforts just to keep them safe. And by doing rhino safety and doing rhino safety well, other species benefit completely off the back of rhino, where if we're doing it in an intensive sort of isolated, semi-isolated environment, we're basically losing out on biodiversity. We're losing out on the potential of protecting other species, and we're losing out on the de-risking of the species, where, again, I'll bring it back to the project site. Right now, we've got just under 2,000 rhino on the project site. If we were to distribute that like our goal and vision states, if we were to distribute that across 15, 20, 25, 30 sites, it's going to be a lot harder to extinguish the species than it would be if they were just kept in small pockets in intensive breeding sites across the continent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation on rhinos, I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So when looking at, rhinos, looking at white rhino specifically, which is kind of what we'll be focusing on here, the note that I have down is, there's kind of two subspecies of rhino. You have the northern white and the southern white. correct me here, but from what I read, the northern white is practically extinct, and the southern white numbers had dramatically decreased. African Parks came in, I think, in 2023, took over, purchased a farm that held 2,000 of these southern white rhinos, with the intention of rewilding them over 10 years of time. And this was back in, I think, September maybe of 2023. I just want to ask you about, this project. I mean, this is fairly recent that this acquisition happened. It's looking at, 2,000, maybe slightly under 2,000 southern white rhinos. Could you talk about, what this means for the population of southern white rhinos, the intention of African Parks coming in and trying to, again, rewild this population?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, obviously, it goes without saying it's an extremely daunting undertaking that African Parks and we've taken on. Moving 2,000 rhino at current. Obviously, the birthing and the reproductive status continues. At the time of transaction, the population was 15%. Of the world's white rhino population, so that's absolutely significant when looking at it at a global scale. I think the conservation imperative, Preston, came from the sort of previous ownership or previous management, where rhino were bred up to a number of well over 2,000, where the intention was not for conservation purposes, but rather for the trade in rhino horn. So we've taken a totally different approach to these rhino. I think in considering and running concurrently, if an organization like ourselves didn't step in, the risk of the population becoming fragmented, being sold off, ones and twos, being exposed to poaching, sort of a little bit unregulated to a large degree, would have been absolutely detrimental to the white rhino population. Running concurrently what's happening or what had happened with the northern whites. Your summary or sort of conclusion on the northern white rhino is 100%, which is the population is basically functionally extinct now. So there's absolutely no ways the northern white rhino is going to be revived as a species without the southern white rhino. And I think the importance there is lessons learned out of the northern white, and to ensure we're never in a situation like that with the southern white rhino. So obviously African Parks at the time were approached by a lot of partners, both government and NGO partners, some of our donors, and the decision was made to come up with some sort of imperative solution to the issue at hand. We chatted about it a little bit in the beginning. This is not normally the sort of approach that African Parks takes. Generally, we partner with governments and communities, and sort of deep dive into managing vast landscapes and protected areas where this is a sort of basically an end result of what could be if a protected area is managed well enough. And I think the two dovetail absolutely brilliantly, in the sense of there's 15% of the world's rhino population. We need to come up with some sort of solution. We truly, deeply, and fundamentally understand what it takes to protect these species, to manage to the effective degree that these species can be safe and turn around positive growth rates in these vast areas. And I think we're quite well positioned to not only obviously attend to ourselves in this and the parks we manage with governments and communities, but also recognize the efforts of other NGOs and other private areas and government areas to that fact, that have been managing these areas well. And basically that's how the 10-year vision popped up or came to mind. It was that we feel that white rhinos going back 100, 120 years, like we discussed, we're down to 30, 50 individuals at most, peaking at just over, I think it's just over 22,000 just before 2020. And that obviously the poaching spike had happened then, and numbers started plummeting. With I think some of the numbers, Preston, were that there's been more than 12,000 rhinos poached since 2012. So it's a fundamental issue that we're facing as protected area managers, as conservationists, and obviously with this audacious undertaking, it's not an easy project. Looking after 2,000 rhino is really, really, really enormous, and I think even so, moving 2,000 rhino is even bigger, and I think there's massive opportunity in a project like this that dovetails nicely with current conservation areas, be it internally within African parks and externally, that are doing a good job, that are looking after rhinos, and that basically present an opportunity that we can establish, whether it's augmented populations throughout the continent, or establish a couple of new populations that would contribute to the species in its entirety is what we're looking for, and what we're hoping to achieve over the next couple of years.
Yeah, a stat that I had down was I think the South African government, this was an article that came out early March. They'd come out and said that South Africa recorded a 16% drop in rhino poaching in 2024. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think that speaks to even what African Parks is doing with looking after these 2,000 some odd rhinos and trying to rewild them eventually. But I would ask, you talk about the challenge of looking after translocating 2,000 rhinos. To me, it seems like an incredible logistical challenge that would be. And I'm curious about, how do you even relocate rhinos? Like, what are the steps in place? Do you load the rhino up on, let's say, some sort of freighter, or are you coming down and picking them up in a plane? How does that all work when you're taking a rhino from one location and then moving it to another?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your summary is 100% correct, Preston. It's a massive undertaking. So how I'd like to explain it to you and your listeners is that if we take a complete step back, what we've done with African Parks is we've split the project in theory into three components. So we've got the rescue component, the rewild component, and the renew component. And how I like to explain it is if you squash those all together, that's basically how it is moving a rhino. So if we start at the rescue component, we need to be cognizant that if we don't look after the well-being of the rhino, the sort of health of the rhino, the genetic diversity of the rhino on a project site, we've got nothing to move. So we need to consider the security, the day-to-day sort of efforts that go into building up towards the move, where we ensure we're moving healthy animals that are sort of basically in their prime, looking at the animals, looking at the security of the animals, and that obviously links into the rewilding component. So we're in a very fortunate position, Preston. We've partnered with extremely competent people. So obviously, from an African Parks perspective, we're responsible for the rhino. We've then gone and partnered with Conservation Solutions, who are extremely well versed in the translocation or the rewilding component of several species, but now specifically from our component looking at rhino. We've also partnered with Wildscapes, a veterinarian sort of company within South Africa. And I mean, basically walking you through it. So we would identify the area, and that's obviously the renew component, the area that would want the rhino. We then We then do quite a bit of back and forth with them submitting an application form that comes to myself. I then go and do a site visit where we consider in depth, the habitat assessment, looking at what the habitat does over the longer term period. We look at their management plans, understand their structures and their financial ability to look after the rhino in a longer period or over a longer period. We also then look at their security, how that looks like, what interventions they've put in place, because there's no silver bullet to the protection of rhino and other species. So we then get all of that information. We then established a rhino rewilding framework that basically guides us on what areas qualify, which areas are more important than other areas, what we should look at. So once we've got all these documentation, we then have an advisory committee who's sort of comprises of a really good group of people, rhino experts that have been doing this for the last 20, 30 years of their life. We then present the area and the recipient area to them. They then give us suggestions or at least concerns or risks. We then obviously document the risks because, again, and I think it's important to note, Preston, we're very, very aware of the fact that moving 2,000 rhino comes with risks, in the move, at the recipient area. So we try as best as possible to look at all these risks and mitigate these risks. Once we've got the final input from the advisory committee, we then take it to the African Parks Executive Committee, who then basically either sign off or decline the move. Then it comes into the nuts and bolts. So generally how it would work is the night before the capture, we would have a big briefing. So all the vets, all the sort of security personnel, all the capture teams, the vet nurses, the assistants, we all sit around a table and we basically discuss what the plan of action is for the morning. And then next morning, first light, generally what happens is the helicopter starts up. Obviously, these are not tame hand-reared animals, so we have to catch them in a way you would any other animal in an open system. So we put a veterinarian in the helicopter with a well-trained pilot, and the helicopter goes up. We then, under the veterinarian's guidance, we dart the respective animals. So sometimes we're doing 8 animals a day, sometimes we're doing 16 animals a day, and sometimes we're doing 32 animals a day, all dependent on what the recipient area is requesting. We then dart the animal. We've then got ground crews that go in and basically process the animal, if you will. And I know it's not processing in the sense of like major scale. Each rhino has got identifying notches that we ensure align to the data sheets. We then take the necessary bloods and fit the necessary tracking devices and collars. Obviously, all interlinking to research and post-monitoring requirements as dictated by us as the custodians of the rhino. The rhino are then basically woken up and walked into crates. So we've got different size crates for different size rhinos. Obviously, constantly under veterinarian supervision, ensuring that the rhinos are healthy, ensuring that they're calm, that stress is mitigated. The rhinos are then loaded. Once all the rhinos are in the crates, they're then loaded onto the trucks. They're then strapped down. And then basically the long journey starts, Preston. So we then ride in convoy, sometimes 2 trucks, sometimes 5 trucks with support vehicles and a bit of a security component attached to it. Some of the journeys are 9 hours from project site. And I think the one we've done most is a 19-hour drive from project site, where we go immediately, and once the rhinos are, the clock starts ticking and we start driving. Once we get to the recipient site, we've ensured that there's temporary holding facilities, that there's enough water and enough food in these temporary holding facilities. We then offload the rhino. basically either 18, 16, 24 rhino per holding facility, depending on the environment of the receiving area. The rhino are then kept in those sort of holding facilities for no more than 72 hours. Again, obviously verified by a vet. We just want to ensure that the two major things, that the rhinos are eating and that the rhinos are drinking. If once we verified that, all the sort of drugs and narcotics that have been used on the rhino are generally out of their system, and then we basically open up the gates for the rhino to move out into the recipient areas. Generally, this happens either, like I said, it's a once-off, or once we've offloaded the rhino, the trucks turn around, we get back to project site, and the next day we start catching again, depending on the scale. So the fun part is moving the rhino, the administration, the hard work, and the planning. I mean, I take it one of the moves we did last year that we managed to successfully move 120 rhino to. We actually did a calculation, and it took us 18 months of planning from the initial conversation to the execution. So it's a significant sort of undertaking, and the logistics are absolutely astronomical. You know, it goes above and beyond the costs associated, like I said, with the rescue, the rewild, and the renew components. Once those things are all dovetailed, by the end of the day, you can definitely realize that you've done a bit of work once those rhino reach their recipient areas or the places that they're going to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot more complex than you think to relocate a rhino. All these different things kind of got to come together. I would ask, I mean, you talk about these risks, you talk about the process of, verifying before you even move the rhinos with all these different stakeholders within African parks. But I do want to kind of look at the risk for a second, because obviously I think a lot of our listeners, they're familiar with poaching, how, people, there's like an illegal trade of horns, and it's like a terrible thing. I would ask, is there a risk when moving the rhinos that there's outside people that are trying to maybe even stop the travel of the rhinos for poaching? And then I would kind of segue that to another question of, once you actually release these rhinos into the new environment in your renew component, what kind of security is in place? I mean, you talk about tracking devices, but how do you make sure that these rhinos, these southern white rhinos, aren't going to be impacted by something like poaching? I know that's a lot of questions, but just everything on my mind right now.
But it's, I mean, all valid. So Preston, to your first question, on the translocation or on the actual rewilding, is there a risk? There are several risks, and I think the approach we've taken, and the approach that we are actually quite comfortable with, is complacency is our biggest risk around moving these rhinos. We've got a massive responsibility on us to ensure the rhinos are moved from point A to point B successfully. So there is nothing we don't consider. So, I mean, the probability of interception, if you will, on the translocation is there, but there's so much more that could go wrong. A truck could break down. A crate could fall off the truck. There could be a road that gets washed away. We've been stuck in traffic for 5 or 6 hours on some of our moves. So all of these things we're always calculating, and that's why it's so important, the logistical component on the preparation and the lead up. That being said, we also learning out of this. We've made mistakes. We've absolutely made mistakes in our translocations. For example, taking the wrong route at the wrong time of day, which ended up in a unnecessary time delay. Not having a spare truck on route, that one of the trucks broke, and we had to make a plan and do some fancy footwork. So So I think while there's seemingly some sort of areas that are more sort of, how can I say, louder than others, there's absolutely small minutiae decisions that need to be made to ensure that it doesn't end up in a catastrophic event, if you will. So again, I reiterate the point there, is that the moment we get complacent and the moment we say, oh, we've done this once before, we know what we're doing, then we need to have a long, hard look at ourselves, you know. Um, to your question on the security, at the sites or at the recipient areas, I think it's safe to say we know that poaching is an issue. You know, we know that it's a battle that most of us in the conservation sort of space is facing, and it's a phone call every researcher, every conservationist, every ecologist, every protected area manager dreads the day that they get that phone call that something has happened to one of their rhino, elephant, lion, whatever the case may be. So I think the one thing that is the good takeaway out here, Preston, and this is what we've seen really, really sort of early on in our project, is that the conservation community is so connected and so linked with one another that efforts are basically going from strength to strength against this fight of anti-poaching, you know, against sort of protecting rhino and ensuring that there's no rhino losses. So there's a lot of mitigation measures that are put in place. We spoke about tracking devices and rhino tags a little bit earlier on. So there's a couple that go on the foot. There's some that go in the ears. So there's really, really good technology being developed that we can ensure we look at these rhino, we know where they are 24/7. There's rhino monitors that are in reception or recipient areas that basically look at the rhino every single day, make records of them. There's guys, rangers on the foot in the field that are dedicating their lives day in and day out to protecting not only rhino but other species. So I think there's an absolute sort of realization of this is what it takes to get the job done, and this is what we're going to do. That being said, we don't always win, you know, and we're aware of that. We're aware of the fact that we're going to send rhino to places, and we are unfortunately going to incur losses. I think the biggest thing out of this and the biggest piece of work we're doing is we are ensuring that we're not sending rhino into a big black hole. You know, we do due diligence on the security component, and more importantly, our agreements with our partners, be it government, community, or private, makes room that there can be an adaptation, you know. And I think that's the crux here, is that there are risks. We are going to lose rhino on translocations and on some of the moves. We are going to fall victim to poaching down the line. The point is, and the justification, or rather the way forward there, is how we adapt, and we constantly need to keep adapting to ensure the protection of these species, you know. So I think the fundamentals are in there. It's just back to the point that I think most people speak for it. The moment we get complacent and say, oh, they'll never come to us, or they'll never poach our animals or come into our property, that's the moment where things go wrong. But there's an absolute drive and a realization that we've got a task at hand, and we need to do that to the best of our ability.
Yeah, I love the aspect of tracking and monitoring, because you know what African Parks could do, or what other NGOs could do in a case like this, is, you know, they could say, look, we went through the phases, we rescued, we rewilded, and then we renewed, and then now our hands are off. Like we did what we set out to do, and that's that. But what I love is that African Parks is saying, no, while we've achieved the translocation, the rewilding component, we're still going to monitor and track and make sure this species of southern white rhino are not going to be affected by these external threats, right? These threats that are kind of outside of the control here. So I think it really, and I might have talked about this term on other episodes too. It's really employing this element of systems thinking, which is exactly what African Parks is doing across this whole process of even finding locations of where to, transport these rhinos. I will ask you, Don, though, when looking at, I think, and again, I might be butchering this date, but I think September 2023 is when the farm was purchased, it was acquired, and then now we're in April of 2025. So you're talking maybe 18, 20 months. I do want to understand the achievements, the accomplishments to date, like how many rhinos have been relocated. What are kind of the plans year over year until you hit that 10-year mark? And just kind of trying to wrap my head around, what has happened since acquisition back in the later part of 2023.
Yeah, sure, Preston. So obviously it was a sort of sink or swim moment that we got in there, and we had to jump around. The moment we went hard with our vision, we had said, we're giving this 10 years and we're giving this our best. So to date, and as we sit here to date, I think a couple of the major achievements is last year we managed to achieve a 8.7% growth rate, which I think is phenomenal on the population in its entirety. We managed to achieve a under 1% death rate on the project site. And if you look at protected areas and open areas, that's less than natural mortality would be on a rhino population. So we really turned management around in that sense. Looking at well-being, looking at the supplement feeding of the rhino. We don't feed the rhino the whole year round because of the density and the concentration of rhino. When the grass layer starts dying off in the drier seasons, we then start supplement feeding them. We partnered with a whole bunch of local companies where we developed our own rhino feed, so we could control the protein levels. Over and above that, the justification or the reasoning for developing our own feed was that we can also ship the feed to our recipient areas, be it in South Africa's borders or abroad, where we know we're sending feed that the rhino are accustomed to. If there's a bit of a longer transition on the adaptation into their new environment. On the staff component, we sort of maintained the staff level, and I think we're sitting at 150 staff at the moment. So it's a really, really sort of well managed, well functioning project, which obviously makes the rewilding component a lot easier. And then I think most importantly, we managed to rewild 376 rhino last year in the first year, with two populations being destined for outside of South Africa. So we've got them in a bit of a staging post, just making them sort of more exposed to climate and ticks and parasites and flies, because of the fact that the project site is a relatively dry, naive site when it comes to those sorts of things. So those rhino would hopefully go to two of our parks that are sort of under our mandate and management within the next couple of months. We then did a community conservancy or reserve in South Africa, Munyawana, 40 rhino. That was our first move. We then sent 120 rhino to the Greater Kruger Environmental Protection Foundation. So those are the consortium reserves to the west of Kruger National Park. We then fortunately established one new population in Limpopo province, which was only our target for this year. We didn't think we were going to get a new population established out of year one. And then I think most importantly, between sort of then and now, we've lined up another 18 recipient areas, of which quite a few of them are regionally based. So in neighboring countries in South Africa, and a large portion of them are within South Africa as well. So we've really hit the ground running, and obviously we'd like to keep that momentum going. It's one of those things where it's a really hard push, Preston. We actively talking to partners, and I think the hardest part of it all is basically making sure that the finances are in place to do the moves, to support the moves, and to support the project. But the sort of general consensus around the Rhino world, people that are now interested in Rhino that maybe previously weren't, is really speaking volumes to the project, and basically complementing quite a bit what the project wants to achieve, and how we go about achieving that.
Yeah, I mean, the stat that you shared of how many rhinos that you actually rewilded last year, it's more than one per day, which is crazy. It's what that stat comes out to in your first year. And you did talk about this element of finance and making sure all the finances are together to actually move these rhinos into the new areas. That does kind of lead me into a question. I don't work in logistics, but I work a lot with logistics in my day-to-day job, so I can understand the cost associated with transporting, large amounts of material. With this particular project, where is the financing really coming from? I mean, we talk about African Parks as this NGO. You've mentioned a lot of the partners that kind of come together. And even in the beginning, when this farm was purchased, there had to be a lot of financing coming together. So, yeah, where does that financing come from? Is this external donation? How does that work? Because over 10 years of time, I feel like it would need a lot of money coming in to actually do this large scale project.
Yeah, correctly so, Preston. So obviously right now, I mean, as you well aware, African Parks is a NPO. So most of our sort of donations either come through philanthropic donations, or sort of institutional funding, either the EU, or obviously up until recently USAID, US Wildlife Fisheries, and those sorts of things. So there's obviously people that are very passionate about sort of conservation, people that believe what African Parks do, and what we do, and they fund towards it. I think it's one of those things that's always in the back of our minds. The one side of our mind we're worrying about 2,000 rhino, the other side of the mind we're worrying about how we're going to support these rhino, and how we're going to fund the 10-year project. You mentioned it over the 10-year time frame. The estimates that we've got at the moment is that it roughly costs us $1,800 to move a rhino locally, excess of about $3,500 regionally, give or take a couple of hundred here and there, depending on where the rhino are going regionally, and accessibility, and probably roughly about $50,000 sort of continentally, northern and East Africa. So it doesn't take a PhD in finances to understand that you quickly do $50,000 times 2,000 rhino. It's a significant ask, and I think again that we need to bring it back, and we need to sort of address the why. Is that we're spending money on moving these rhino to contribute towards the ecosystem and biodiversity. Again, we're putting a monetary value on something that plays an ecological role, but without the money, we're not going to be able to get this across the line. So it's thanks to donors, partners. Some of the recipient areas within South Africa paid for the translocations through shareholders and basically stockholders in the reserve or the recipient area. So without those two, without a willing reserve and a willing donor, it would make our lives quite significantly harder to move these rhinos from A to B and get our vision across the line in the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I ran that quick math. I mean, that's $100 million, 50,000 multiplied by 2,000, 100 million. So yeah, a lot of funding that's needed, a lot of donation that's needed from, these external groups. But I think that the final thing I'll ask you here, Don, is, any of our listeners that are, tuned into this episode, that have enjoyed listening about this, that want to help, is there ways that the everyday person can help with this 10-year plan of relocating, rewilding these rhinos across Africa? Is there things that the everyday person can do, regardless of where you are in the entire world, that you can do to help this cause?
Most definitely, Preston. So there's one of two ways. Obviously, AfricanParks.org is our one website, which is the sort of it explains everything on African parks, what we're doing, what areas, what countries we active in, and it gives the reader a lot more background on African parks as a whole. We then have Rhino Rewild .org, which is obviously linked to our African Parks website, and we do have an online platform that is basically dedicated to sending a rhino home, where the average sort of Joe, which is not a massive philanthropist or an institutional donor, can contribute. So there's different options and different packages on the website, and I think Preston, most importantly on that is that we at a stage where every single dollar counts. We've learned from the past, and we discussed the northern white rhino. We never ever want to be in that position or that state with the southern white. So I think it's very important for your listeners to realize that you don't need to be a multi-billionaire to make a difference. Every single dollar contributes towards something small, whether it's looking after the well-being of the rhino, or it's sending a whole rhino, a whole $50,000 for a rhino to go somewhere into Africa. I think it's it's a bit of a cliche, but you've got to be the change you want to see in the world, and if change in your eyes is a small amount or a large amount, we would send those rhino home into safe spaces. So there is opportunity there. The information is out there, and it's accessible to anyone that's willing to get involved by any means.